happening right now is we're seeing a big drop in spending intentions. So to give a backdrop, last year, maybe in September, we were still seeing very high spending intentions for almost 9.5% growth. And that has come down quite a bit. And what we're going to do now, just given what you do in the retail consumer industry, and just so everyone knows out there, Matthew's been in the industry for quite some time, but does have some expertise in the consumer and particularly retail consumer space. So we're going to kind of go through that a little bit in the backdrop. As we take a look here, we're going to take a look specifically at retail consumer, and maybe you could help us parse out what's happening here. But the reason I'm calling this out, Matthew, is of all the verticals we track in business, retail consumer is showing the biggest change. So back here in September of 2021, our retail and consumer respondents were expecting 11.5% growth in their IT budgets, which is massive. That came down a little bit to 9. Okay, a little bit of a haircut. Our most recent one is now 6.5. So we're talking about almost cut in half in the last 6 months. And this industry, again, is showing the biggest drop of all of them. So let's just stop there for a second. Maybe you could talk to me about what's happening in the retail consumer industry and why we're seeing such a big drop.
Yeah, Eric, I think that what we're seeing is it's playing out in the markets and financial news, you know, all really this week, and we've been seeing it for the last couple of months. There are some headwinds because of inflation. There are headwinds because of concern about consumer sentiment and supply chain problems. And all of those things that are besetting the retail space trickle down to tech spending. And, you know, so from top of house, there are pressures on the budget or pressures on sales projections and so forth that will make its way into tech budgets. Now, you'll notice we're not in the red, we're not negative, we're not projecting to cut spending, but just the growth. And I think this has played out in my role and with many of my colleagues in this space, the projected growth to budgets and tech spending overall, that has been curtailed because of some of those headwinds.
Yeah, certainly. And there's a lot of factors there. I am curious, how quickly do the concerns from the top line of a retail organization go from, okay, given everything you just mentioned, right? Economic uncertainty, even macro geopolitical uncertainty, the inflation, consumer sentiment, that first is going to impact your revenue projections as a company. Then that's going to trickle down to your budget. It seems to me that this happened pretty quickly. So did your executives, you and your executives, have a little bit of a foresight that maybe this type of situation was coming?
Yeah, I'll say generally that when the budget for 22 is put together, and I'm speaking across the sector and speaking on behalf of many of my colleagues in this space, there was some trepidation all the way back into October, November as the budget for 22 was being put together. I think the language that I heard pretty consistently was, this is one of the toughest budgets to create and most difficult to predict how it was going to play out. So there were some warning signs even all the way back then that said we need to be able to be prepared to pivot. We need to be quick to react if what we're seeing says something unfavorable. And sure enough, some of that has started to play out.
And, you know, it was interesting that when I asked specifically why retail consumer, just obviously the inflation and the sentiment, the supply chain seems to be hitting everybody, but consumer sentiment and inflation are going to hit that level first. Oddly enough, the area that had still continued to be the highest spend or dropped the least was in energy and utilities. And that's not what we would normally consider to be a very high spending area. So to your point there, inflation and sentiment are going to hit the consumer first, and maybe last will be the utility companies. You know, but in the end, everyone needs to pass along these costs. So from that perspective, I am curious, as a business operator, do you expect the cost to continue to get passed along in this environment?
I would say my initial answer would be yes. I mean, there's a limit to that everywhere, but yes. And the reason I say that is, in spite of some of this budget tightening that you're seeing, they're really, overall, we're not seeing like a dramatic drop off in sales and revenue in the sector as a whole. And even economic indicators that you may be reading here in these last several days or several weeks suggests that consumer sentiment really hasn't dropped that much. And there's also some belief that inflation is going to slow, some as we play out over maybe the next 6 to 8 months too. So I think that on balance, better days are ahead. I'm not an expert in the utility industry, but I have many colleagues who are. By the way, just as point of clarification here, retail spends a bigger percent of revenue on tech than like hard goods or utilities do. Sure. So maybe their spending might be curtailing more slowly, but their overall raw dollars is not nearly, comparatively speaking, is not nearly as high as it would be in like a consumer sector.
Certainly, and anecdotally from doing these interviews, I'd also say they're playing catch up. Retail True. Consumer had to pivot to a digital transformation much more quickly. They had to get a digital customer experience and commerce engine much more quickly than those guys did. So one of the things I want to kind of go down one step further then is also to talk about where your spending priorities lie then. So obviously budgets got cut. It's a tough conversation, but you still have to decide where to spend. Right now, we're looking at a sector on all industries. I'm going to cut this again one time further, just to kind of go to retail consumer and see if this resonates with you, or if you can give us a little bit of a background on which priorities are left for that budget. Where are you going to spend the dollars that you do have? So as we look at here, one thing that kind of surprised me a little bit about things coming down was in cloud computing. It's still extremely high, but I didn't think this was an area that was really going to drop. Another area which actually probably makes a lot more sense is that the consulting budgets get cut first. And we're also seeing a big drop in laptops, PCs. So maybe without leading you, just kind of showing you a couple of the sectors here. With the budgets that you have left after the cuts were made and agreed upon, what are your sectors of priorities?
Yeah, a couple comments here. First, those call outs that you made, don't surprise me a whole lot. In roles that I've had elsewhere and in my current, cloud spending represents a pretty substantial portion of the operating budget, and our commitment to cloud is not being reduced, but the appetite, the desire to be more cost effective in that space always comes up whenever there's budget tightening. Right. And basically the question is, are we sure that we're optimized? Are we wasting resources in cloud? Go back and take a look at that. My guess is that's the conversation that's being had. I know it is in my space, and probably accounting for some of that. The assumption is we're going to be able to find some efficiencies, do a little bit better in that space. Another budget trick that is always used, and I say trick, but it's a tactic that is used whenever there's a little bit of budget tightening, is let's extend out depreciation curves or delay refreshes on hardware and the like. And so laptops, tablets, endpoint devices of that sort. If you just string that out another 6 months or a year or something like that, you can capture some savings pretty quickly and easily that way. But some of these taller indicators are, in particular, they're wrapped around automation. So there's a consistent theme. And again, why are those priorities? Well, I think they are whether budgets tighten or not, because we see this as opportunity to differentiate, to take advantage of the market, to be a little bit better and faster in the competition, and maybe to reduce some operating expense too. So those don't surprise me. And then also, I don't see it jump out here on the page. There it is in the middle, but security remains pretty steady. Yep. Because that problem, frankly, just isn't going to go away. If anything, it's just going to get bigger.
Right. Yeah, Matthew, so much there to unpack. I'll try to kind of do it quickly and break it down. Not only when the PC laptop side, not only is it a way to kind of shift away from any type of hardware upfront spend, but also you mentioned earlier the supply chain issues. So it's not that easy to get them, and most organizations that we saw pulled forward already or bought what they could early. And I think we're seeing that play out with some of them. We saw Dell and HP have really particularly bad guidance earlier this earnings season as well. excellent point you made about the cloud. And I just wanted to point out quickly here, the biggest drop we've actually seen is with co-location and data center colo. So that's one of those areas where you say our commitment to the cloud's still there, but we can find ways maybe to cut around it. So just a really astute point, and we're seeing that play out here. And I love your optimistic lens, right? So you said, well, let's look at what is going up. RPA, automation, in tough times, anything you can automate should be automated. And we are seeing that here as well. And lastly, the comment you made about security, it seems to be no matter what, this environment, security stays the number one priority. And any of our listeners out there know when we do our macro survey, it is the number one priority. It continues to be so. Connecting that with the valuations in the equity markets, however, is a little bit different, right? Because these names also benefited a lot from that growth valuation, and we'll see where that shakes out. But from an underlying demand point of view, it's nice to hear you say security is still going to remain part of this spend.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I totally agree.
And then on an emerging side, and I don't want to get into it too much, but in this environment, are you still willing to look at younger, newer players, or are you just going to consolidate down to the vendors that you already have?
Yeah, I think that there's plenty of runway for upstarts, new players in the space, especially in the security space, or around cloud and containers, anything in those two spaces. There's a lot of appetite for looking at new players. I think that whether the budgets are getting bigger or getting smaller, I don't think that really changes the way we look at upstart players. If they're filling a void or an area that is otherwise not all that well served, we'll give them a look, and if not, then maybe there's a way to take advantage of somebody who's established.
All right, I'm going to hold on to that and finish up with the macro, and then kind of get into more of your tech stack and the way you do that. There's a particular name that I'm interested in hearing about, which you just said on security, particularly on the container and cloud side. So we'll get to that in a second. But to wrap up sort of this theme on what's happening in the retail consumer, our team just did a little bit of a screening here using our data. We have this fun little model, idea generator model, where we can go in, and essentially what we did here was we narrowed it down to retail consumer. We made sure there was a certain criteria of the number of citations from you and your peers. And then we started to look at the overall net score, which is our proprietary metric for spending health. And then we said, okay, what's changing the most? And what we see here is, unfortunately, from worst to best. And some of the names are kind of what we discussed already. So one of the worst that we're seeing is a hardware PC laptop name on that side. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, I should say, there's a productivity apps here, Smartsheet, which is a really interesting tool. But I would love to maybe talk a little bit about why this name would be on there. Is it simply because most people already have Office 365, and this was maybe a SaaS name that proliferated quickly during the virus and the work from home shift, and we don't need it? I'm just curious, do you have any understanding on maybe what's happening with those productivity SaaS names? Are they as necessary as they were 2 years ago?
Yeah, Eric, I'll give a speculative answer, and some of this is based upon my personal experience too, is that products in that space tend to kind of enter the enterprise through a lot of different places, and not necessarily through tech and guidance, and they don't have the guidance associated with typical tech purchasing. Somebody in finance or product or marketing might introduce a product like this, and then whenever there's some budget tightening, one of the tactics that takes place is to say, where do we have redundancy? Where have we been bringing products in outside of the more normal methods? And maybe we ought to be using more established enterprise products that we have. So things of that sort, and you see, DocuSign and Adobe are all kind of toward the upper part of that list too. I can tell you that in places I've been previously and now, it's not unusual to have more than one e-signature platform for all the reasons I just cited. Then when the budget's tightened, the question gets asked, why do we have more than one of these? And so I think it's that sort of thing that's probably playing out.